Welcome to the Scientific Sense podcast, where we explore emerging ideas from science, policy, economics, and technology. My name is Gil Epen. We talk with world's leading academics and experts about their recent research or general areas of topical interest. Scientific Sense is an unstructured conversation with no agenda or preparation. We cover a wide variety of domains where new discoveries are made and new technologies are developed on a daily basis. We are most interested in how new ideas affect society and help educate the world how to pursue a rewarding and enjoyable life rooted in science, logic, and information. We seek knowledge without boundaries or constraints and provide unedited content of conversations with researchers and leaders who love what they do. A companion blog to this podcast can be found at scientificsense.com, and this podcast is available on over a dozen platforms and directly at scientificsense.net. If you have suggestions for topics, guests, and other ideas, please send them to info@scientificsense.com, and I can be reached at gil@epen.info. My guest today is Professor Adina Roskies, who is Professor of Philosophy and Chair of the Cognitive Science Program and an affiliate of the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences at Dartmouth College. Dr. Roskies' research interests lie at the intersection of philosophy and neuroscience and include philosophy of mind, philosophy of science, and ethics. He has co-authored a book with Stephen Morse, A Primer on Criminal Law and Neuroscience. Welcome, Adina.
Glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. So I want to start with one of your papers, Why Libet Studies Don't Pose a Threat to Free Will, in which you say Benjamin Libet's controversial papers on the neural basis of action and the relation between action and conscious intention have dominated discussions of the effects that neuroscientific understanding can have for our conception of ourselves as free and responsible agents. Before we get into it, who exactly is Benjamin Libet?
He was a neuroscientist working, I believe, at UCSF, and his primary work that has concerned philosophers was done in the 80s. And he made certain claims about the relevance of that work for free will that have been accepted very widely and very uncritically for the most part, and have filtered down into public conception of the problem. And I think that people have just deeply misunderstood the relevance of his work for questions about free will.
So free will, to get a crisp definition for that, Adina. So free will is the ability, and we're talking about humans here, but it could be applied to animals as well, I would imagine. But the ability of a human to do things as he or she wants, right? Is it a crisper definition?
That certainly wouldn't be the philosophical definition, but let's just say it is the ability of humans to act in a way that is self-generated, and yes, I think in accordance with their intentions, and there are a bunch of philosophical issues involving how to best understand the concept that I'm afraid can't be discharged in a sentence or two.
Yeah. Okay. So Libet's work, as you say, he sort of concluded that based on some of the experiments he had done, sort of concluded that we don't really have free will.
He thought his experiments pretty much ruled out the possibilities for free will, because his interpretation of his experiments was that our brain decided to do things before we did. And so we weren't really the ones making the decisions to act in particular ways.
could you describe the experiments that he did?
Yeah, the most um, I guess the most consequential one and the one that most people know about is he asked people to spontaneously move their fingers or their wrists while he was recording brain signals, EEG signals from their scalp.
Mm.
And at the same time that they were doing these, what he classified as free movements or freely willed movements, they were also looking at a dot going around a clock face and making a mental note of the time at which they had the urge or formed the intention to move.
Mm.
And then he looked at the brain signals preceding these movements and tried to coordinate that with the time at which they felt the urge to move. And he found that there were brain signals that were discernible well before people reported willing to move.
How much before?
Several hundred milliseconds. So for the most part, the brain signals in a signal that's called the readiness potential start about, it's quite variable, but approximately 500 milliseconds before people move. And the time at which they reported willing to move was about 200 milliseconds before the time at which they moved.
Is it measurable to that level though? So if I understand this correctly, the person himself is determining. So the dot going around the clock face. He or she is saying, "This is when I decided." Right? Is it?
Right. They're just saying when I decided to move, the dot was at 3 or something
Yeah.
like that. Yeah.
Okay. And so there could be errors in it, I would imagine as well, right? It's less than a second that we are talking about.
Sure. There's a wide variability if you look at individual, on individual trials, if you look at the answers people give. And that's, I think, one of the problems is that it's really unclear what the error range is. I think that it's been replicated pretty robustly that people tend to answer approximately 200 milliseconds before they move. And it's also been replicated that they show these readiness potentials well before that. So I think that the basic finding isn't in question. The question is, what does that finding mean? How do you interpret that finding?
Hmm.
So yeah, I
And
think there are many issues here about noise and everything. But even if you put those things aside and you accept the basic empirical findings, I think there are real issues in interpretation, and I think that the way in which people have interpreted it are mistaken in terms of the relevance for the free will question.
so from my own understanding, Adina, so the measurement here is that when the person says he decided to move the finger,
Mm-hmm.
500 milliseconds before that, you can actually see the activity in the brain. Is that the idea?
Right. It's more like 300 on average, but yeah. So, significantly before in terms of, time, there's a signal in the brain. I can give you a whole variety of reasons that this is problematic.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want me to do it right now.
Yeah. I mean, just without knowing a lot about it at the intuitive level, I can think of many. The person has to be aware of something in the brain, and the person in the experiment is probably a poor judge of when and what things have happened, really. And we're not talking about long time intervals. So what are your objections to this?
So there are a number of objections about, first of all, whether this is even the kind of experimental paradigm that tests something like free action or free willing.
Yeah.
You're being instructed to do this very bizarre task. And it is a bizarre task because in normal in normal life, we're not typically reporting on the time at which we become conscious of some mental decision,
Mm.
and we're actually not very good at doing that. And so people who've done the task, I think, find it weird, and it's not at all clear that they're doing a good job at this kind of reporting. But moreover, because it's so weird, it clearly isn't the kind of thing that we normally are doing when we act in ways in which we're acting, presumably freely.
Yeah.
But I think the biggest problem with this is that the signal that is measured from the brain, the readiness potential, is a signal that only emerges when you average many trials together, or it's only clearly emerging when you average many trials together, time locked to the action.
Mm.
And it has been standardly interpreted as a signal that starts when the this average trace deviates from baseline, but and the interpretation is that at the point at which it deviates from baseline, the brain has already decided something. But I think that that's a completely mistaken way of thinking about it, because in fact, what is much more likely is that what you're seeing is a decision process that
Yeah.
that culminates. The decision is made just prior to moving, or around the time that people become conscious of moving. And
Right.
it's an artifact of sampling. If you always time lock things to movements, you're only sampling these epochs in which people actually move. And so if it is actually a decision process, then it's necessarily going to create this kind of ramping signal, even though there may be no such ramp in the real individual instances.
Mm.
And yeah, so this idea that your brain is making a decision at the onset, I think, is the fundamental problem. There's no reason to think that what that signal is reflecting in the aggregate is a process that culminates in you and your brain at the same time making a decision, which is exactly what someone who's not a dualist would think.
Right, right, yeah. So mechanistically, that makes a lot of sense to me. For me to move my finger, I have to prepare the system to do that, and that preparation would require mental activity, I would imagine. And so there are two questions, I guess. One is, when does the mental activity start, and secondary one is, when do I become conscious of that mental activity? This could be instinctual, actually. I don't necessarily have to be conscious. If this is something that I do on a routine basis, I don't necessarily have to be conscious about it, right? It could be an instinctual thing, but there is a electrochemical signal that needs to happen for that to work.
Yeah, I mean, you do. I think that typically when we act uh, volitionally, when we use our will, we are conscious of what we're deciding. But I don't need to be conscious of the process that is the process of decision making. What I have to be conscious of is the decision.
Hmm.
And this kind of experiment is asking you to become conscious of something other than the decision. In a sense, you're being conscious of having an intention to do something, which is not the same as conscious of the decision to do something. And so I think that's one problem. But the other problem is thinking that there is this time at which the you know the process has an onset, rather than thinking much more holistically of people acting in the face of ongoing neural activity. I mean, your brain is always doing stuff, and there may be no set time before your decision at which, or in a process of deciding at which the deviation from baseline always starts. And if
Right.
you're averaging all these things together, you're going to get something that looks like a ramp, but it may not, in fact, look anything like that in individual trials.
Hmm. And so people sort of like this, and it got into popular press, so to speak. So what's the status quo now based on your research, Adina? I mean, what do you believe? Does free will exist?
Oh, I do believe that free will exists. I'm not sure that, that the folk ideas of what free will requires are correct. So I think that there are a lot of misconceptions people have about free will, like we have to be acting outside the causal nexus if if we act. If determinism is true, for instance, then we can't have free will. I think that's a mistake. Um, so I think that free will consists in our exercising certain kinds of capacities. Sometimes it's possible that we may not have those capacities, or that our will may be impeded from the outside. But for the most part, I think that we have those capacities, and that we can have free will whether or not determinism is true. Um, and I think that really what you want to think about are what kinds of capacities are required for free will, and what many people think hinges on it, which is moral responsibility. Um, so right now I'm finishing up a paper with Aaron Sugar that's going to, at least I hope, be published in Trends in Cognitive Sciences, which sort of reviews the recent literature on the readiness potential and tries to sort of change the way in which people have viewed this whole literature. But if you think of decision making as a stochastic uh, process, which has been the model that has been really effective in psychology and neuroscience in all sorts of other domains, then what you would expect to see that would just fall out of this model is an RP. But the RP, the beginning of the RP, is essentially an artifact, and it doesn't signify the beginning of a decision process. It just comes out of a certain kind of way of analyzing data when there is a decision making model underlying it. And so if you're making a decision in the face of having no evidence and no reasons, which you have in the Libet paradigm, then you would expect to see exactly an RP when you take EEG data and average it the way Libet did.
And this RP, what does RP stand for? Some sort of potential?
Readiness potential, yeah.
Readiness potential. So is there an intensity measure there when we measure that?
There is an amplitude to it, if that's what you mean.
Amplitude,
Yeah.
yeah. So do we see sort of different amplitudes in different sort of situations?
You do. I
Now,
mean, there are certain things that seem to modulate the amplitude. So tension and anticipation and modulate the amplitude. Planning seems to. Novelty or uncertainty may. There's some reports to that effect. So there are many things that seem to affect it. But there's, to my mind, no evidence yet that thinking of it as just an effect of the analysis procedure that's used is the right way to think of it. That I don't think of it as a real signal in the brain that's causally efficacious in the description of what it is to initiate an action.
so um, so our current viewpoint, and there has been some ideas around free will out of quantum mechanics, the many worlds interpretation. And if you trace that back, there has been some arguments that you cannot really have free will in any situation. Um, so, so from a neuroscience perspective, our at least our thinking right now is that free will does exist. People make decisions on their own. And so what is the, sort of the best experiment from a neuroscience perspective that establishes free will?
So I want to, I think, correct you. I don't think that the neuroscience view is at all some sort of consensus that we have free will. I think
Uh,
probably most neuroscientists think we don't have free will. And I think
hmm,
that's because they don't understand the philosophy underlying free will. I think people think if something is mechanistic, then it is determined and unfree. And I think that it's a mistake to think determinism means lack of freedom. I also think that it's a mistake to think mechanism means determinism. And so I think that there's just lots of avenues in which you could maintain free will, even if our brains are mechanistic or physics is deterministic. But I should also note that there are, you know, interpretations of quantum mechanics that are indeterministic, and there are interpretations that are deterministic. And so
yeah.
even physics has not decided about the question of determinism. And I don't think that's something that neuroscientists will be able to do a better job at.
Hmm. Yeah, I can see the mechanistic aspect. So just because something is mechanistic, I can understand that argument that you cannot really say things are predetermined. But deterministic for me, maybe I'm not understanding it properly. Deterministic means essentially there is no variability in future expectations. In other words, you have only one path to go. In that sense, I don't know how free will could be properly.
Sorry?
Maybe I'm not understanding, the word determinism in the neuroscience context.
The word deterministic in neuroscience is exactly what it is in uh, philosophy, or it should be anyway, which is that,
Yeah.
yeah, if you knew everything, the complete state of the world and all of the governing equations, you could describe the world at any other point. You would know exactly the way the universe would be in the future
Hmm.
or the past. Um, so yeah, but there is a very large and um, excellent body of philosophical work on positions called compatibilism that argue that free will can exist even if determinism is true.
Hmm. And so if X and Y are fixed, Adina, so is the free will part of this that is that you can trace a path from X to Y in different ways, even though X and Y are sort of fixed?
No, no, it's that what it is to for someone to move forward in time, uh,
Yeah.
if it engages the right kinds of decision making capacities, then they are exercising their capacities to will and freely doing so. I mean, there's nothing unfree about the laws of nature on this view.
Hmm. But if the future is fixed, even if I don't do anything, that future state would happen, right?
No, it means that if the future is fixed, then it's only fixed in the way it is because you do or do not do something.
Hmm. Okay. And this is where this might be a sort of an engineering confusion, in the sense that and so when we do economic models, we think about future as evolving stochastically, and our decision models use dynamic programming when we have sequential decisions. And so there is nothing deterministic, at least from an economics perspective, about the future. And so this is where, when I think of a deterministic future, I think of it differently. that
Well, I mean,
that you
the difference here, and I think the mistake that you're making is that you're assuming that your stochastic input is in fact stochastic. But if determinism is true, then what you call noise is actually, uh, you know, determined.
right.
So, right, it's the real question is there real noise in the universe, or is that noise, what looks to us to be noise, just more deterministic signal? And, I don't think that anyone in neuroscience and probably nobody in experimental physics can answer that question. And I think the question really ultimately ends up being a question for theoretical physics.
Right. So in that sense, you say noise is pre-programmed. It looks stochastic, but in some sense, it's evolving in a pre-programmed fashion.
If determinism is true, yeah,
If
that
it,
is what would necessarily be the case, right? If determinism is true, then what we look at as noise in our measurements isn't really noise. It's real, it's the effects of all the laws of nature evolving. But because we don't know those laws, and we don't know the precise state of the universe at any given time, we can't identify that as those effects. We identify it as noise.
so you argue even if determinism is true and noise is pre-programmed in that sense, free will still exists.
I believe that that is possible, yes. I mean, I think that there are lots of philosophical positions in which it just doesn't matter whether or not determinism is true to answer the question of whether somebody is free or not free.
Hmm. I remember reading in the paper, there's a distinction between free will and free won't, right? So going back to the experiment, you could ask if the person decides not to move the finger, and then there is a distinction between the two.
So Libet suggested that he thought he had ruled out the possibility of free will because our brains decide before we do, but he thought that it was possible that we could salvage something like free will through what he called free won't, which is the idea that in the 300 or so milliseconds between the point at which he thought our brains decided and the point at which we willed something, we could change our minds and maybe preserve our free will by being able to reject the decisions that our brains had made. But it turns out that when people decide not to do something, it turns out that the brain signals show the same kinds of timing. So basically, there's no way that you could salvage free will from the Libet with the Libet idea of free won't.
Okay. Adina, we'll take a quick break. When we come back, we'll talk about your agency and intervention.
Okay, sounds good.
This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com. So we are back. Adina, I want to go into one of your papers, a little bit dated, 2015, entitled Agency and Intervention. You said novel ways to intervene on brain function raise questions about agency and responsibility. And you discuss whether direct brain interventions, in particular deep brain stimulation, pose a threat to agency in individual cases or to our general conceptualization of what it is to be a responsible agent. So how do you define agency in this context?
Well, agency is a philosophical concept that I think nobody has really managed to define. And part of the project I'm involved in is trying to get a better handle on what it is. But it's related to the topic of free will. I mean, it's about the ability to act, and with respect to humans, the ability to act in ways that secure their well-being, promote their good and their interests, essentially allow people to live full and flourishing lives. And part of that involves, being able to be responsible members of society, etc. So the question is, if someone is messing around with your brain, how does that affect your agency? Does it undermine it? Does it leave you unfree, or does it leave you somehow compromised as an agent? And the paper explores various ways in which it might and doesn't, and I think just pointed me on a path to think more deeply about what agency is and how we might be able to get a way of getting a handle on the kinds of effects on agency that neural interventions might pose.
Physical intervention. So is agency an entity different from the individual, or is it a characteristic?
I think of it as some kind of description of the individual's capacities to be an agent, right? So I'm an agent, my dog is an agent, but we're very different kinds of agents, and I'm interested in how to characterize the differences in the kinds of agents that we are. We can both make decisions, procure food to a certain extent, chase things we want, but we're different in our decision-making capabilities and some of our social abilities and other ways of navigating the world. So that's really what I'm interested in.
Yeah, yeah. It's a somewhat of a strange concept. So,
Sorry.
no worries. So, in the book of the great rock band Pink Floyd, there's a song that goes something like, "There's somebody in my brain, and that's not me." The people seem to struggle in some sense with their brain, with their decision-making processes. So philosophically and conceptually, is there a difference between one's brain and oneself?
I mean, in certain ways, yes, and in certain ways, no. I think one's self is certainly constituted in large part by one's brain. You wouldn't be a self if you had no brain.
Right.
But there are certain aspects of the self that aren't just brain. I mean, and if you believe in embodiment, for instance, then you're a different person if you got a body than if you don't have a body. So I think that you can look to the brain for some information about the self, but we don't really understand that relationship very well. But I don't think that you can sort of reduce the self to the brain or at least it's not entirely clear to me that you could reduce the self to the brain alone.
Yeah, so this is obviously not true, but one could think about the brain as a computer, and the individual essentially using that computer. And in the era of artificial intelligence, we are, increasingly seeing the computer becoming more intelligent and telling the human what to do. And so, is that relationship between the brain as sort of a machine and the individual something greater than that? Uh, does that relationship work from a neuroscience perspective?
I guess I don't understand how the uh, individual could use the machine of our brains without it being. I mean, we are not separate from our brains, right? I am separate from my computer and I can act on it. And to some degree, I can act on my own brain. I mean, I can choose to, think about various things, which is essentially part of my brain affecting other parts of my brain. But I am not separate from my brain such that I can use it like a tool.
Yeah. So that is that. I guess you could think about it different ways. So deep brain stimulation. You say so. This is essentially electrodes. What exact? How is deep brain stimulation done?
Yes, the neurosurgeon implants electrodes into parts of your brain, usually subcortical structures, uh, and then the electrodes are connected to a stimulator, a power source that stimulates the neural tissue at certain frequency, certain amplitude, and changes the way in which those circuits function in ways that are poorly understood, but demonstrably effective at ameliorating certain kinds of symptoms. So it's a very effective FDA approved treatment for otherwise intractable Parkinson's disease. And there are hundreds of thousands of people who are undergoing deep brain stimulation as we speak.
Hmm.
So it is happening. And then, there are case reports of kind of strange effects that these stimulators might have on people. Um, changing them from rational to psychotic, or changing the contents of their desires, or turning them into people who have compulsive gambling problems, or changing their personality or their mood. So all these things have been reported. And the question is both why does that happen, and what neuroethically should we make of it? How should we think about these kinds of consequences? What are their ethical implications? So that's really what this project is trying to consider.
Yeah. So this is truly a sort of a physical intervention of the brain, and we see some beneficial effects in disease states like Parkinson's. And the question here is that an ethical thing to do?
Yeah, I mean, that's in some ways, I think that question has been answered
Yeah.
because these people without the treatment are so compromised that it's unethical to leave them in that state without, if we can do something about it. But there are sometimes side effects that are unforeseen and hard to, it's just not obvious how we should think about them ethically, or how to weigh those negative effects against the positive effects of the treatment. And so those are the kinds of questions. It's really, not just what to make about the fact that we are affecting people by intervening in their brain function, which you might think is, something that all other things considered equal we shouldn't be doing. But also how to think about the sometimes negative side effects and how to weigh treatment decisions in the face of those kinds of side effects.
Is the treatment effect here sort of permanent, or this is something that they do over and over again?
It is a chronic, I mean, you basically continually stimulate, and if you turn off the stimulator, all of the motor effects or symptoms of Parkinson's return immediately.
Okay, okay. And so do we pick up sort of holistic side effects like personal change in personality and things like that because of this?
What do we pick up? What do
Yeah.
you mean by that?
Does going back to sort of the agency question, do we see sort of things like personality changes and things like that because of the treatment?
Yes, that does occur. It's not clear to what percentage. I think there's no real database that keeps track of the frequency of occurrence of these things, but there are certainly case reports that report all kinds of sometimes bizarre kinds of effects that are really philosophically interesting and a little bit disturbing. I mean, there's this fascinating case study of a man who had very eclectic musical tastes, and then when they started deep brain stimulation, he only wanted to listen to Johnny Cash, and that was his, under stimulation, it was the only thing that he had any desire to hear. And then at some point they stopped stimulation because they needed to adjust the electrodes or something, that for medical reasons they stopped stimulation for a period, and all of his old interests came back, and then when they restarted he went back to wanting only Johnny Cash.
Yeah, so your conclusion in the paper, then, you say you don't see evidence that these interventions constitute a global challenge to the concept of agency. But you also say that therapeutic approaches could be improved with a more nuanced, multidimensional view of agency. So what do you mean there?
Well, I mean, I think some people think that just the mere fact that we can physically change someone's agency
Yeah.
suggests that agency isn't real in some way, and I reject that. I think it doesn't bother me at all that agency has a physical basis in the brain, but I think that we could undermine aspects of people's agency because of some of these effects, and with a better understanding both of how stimulation influences agency and what aspects of agency are essential, and what the ethical implications are of messing around with various aspects of agency, we would be able to better design our therapies and better deal with unforeseen effects of our therapies.
Yeah, I mean, this has implications, right? So, if I understand this correctly, the typical FDA process looking for a therapeutic index that can be more, easily measured. Something like this, the therapeutic index need to take into account variety of other things that are typically not there, right? The side effects that you talked about,
Mm-hmm.
and how that could impact needs to be taken into account before the therapy could be approved.
Well, I mean, I don't know that I want to go that far. I think that the fact that the therapy has been approved has helped very many people.
Hmm.
But I think that the therapy might be improved by paying attention to these side effects and trying to understand, what particular confluence of technology and individual neuroanatomy might lead to these side effects. We might be able to avoid them better in the future. So
Yeah.
I don't know that I'd want to advocate that any FDA approval would have to, be beholden to this working out, but but we got funding from the NIH to try to study this and measure the effects of deep brain stimulation on agency.
I want to go into another paper, Adina. So, neurotechnologies for mind reading, prospects for privacy. You say neuroimaging techniques provide unprecedented access to a variety of information about the brain, including to some extent the contents of thoughts. And so, we all seen these pictures, right? Neuroimaging technologies are improving, and the privacy issue here is, if I understand this correctly, we can start attaching more importance to this images, and perhaps we can start to interpret them, possibly, right? Is that the issue?
Yeah, I mean, we do in research settings interpret them, and the question is how well can we interpret them, and what fineness of grain can we give to the contents that we are assigning to these images. And I think we're far from being able to read people's thoughts in any kind of fine-grained way, anything that would count as mind reading. But we're a lot closer to it than I thought we would be 10 years ago. So, methods have improved remarkably. There are a lot of new innovations that allow you to assign content, I think, much better than we used to be able to. And it's not entirely clear how much better we'll get in the future.
Yeah, so I mean, if it is just complexity that is preventing us from getting there, to completely read somebody's mind, that then turns out to be sort of a problem that can be solved with better technology over time, right? So, do you think we are on a path to ultimately fully able to interpret those images as reading the mind?
No, I mean, it. I would say in the limit, if you
Yeah.
knew everything about, if you could get really, really fine-grained information, we could do a whole lot better. But there, I think big theoretical barriers still for trying to translate. There's quite a bit of individual variability, for instance, and even though there's quite a bit more commonality than I might have thought, I still think that there are lots of barriers to being able to read minds in some kind of magical way. So I don't expect we're ever going to get to the point where you can put somebody in the scanner and just read their thoughts out, but I think that we'll be able to tell a lot more than I might have thought we could 10 years ago. So
yeah, I mean, the risk there is, if you sort of look at unsupervised machine learning type techniques, where we can put patterns into buckets using those types of techniques. So even though we don't precisely be able to read somebody's thoughts, yeah, we might be able to get, sort of the general bucket, so to speak, where their thoughts might reside. And if that is possible, it has a lot of implications, right? And so that's one of your concerns in terms of privacy. If technology advances and we can, if not precisely, but generally say what category the thoughts might belong, that has sort of applications and concerns.
right. Yeah, I think that's right.
So I want to look at one other thing, and this is a paper in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on neuroethics. Neuroethics focuses on ethical issues raised by our continually improving understanding of the brain, as we just talked about, and by consequent improvements in our ability to monitor and influence brain function. Um, so there is sort of an internal concern. How do we influence the brain with external force? And then there is sort of this other concern that we talked about, that just reading, we could actually make some decisions. So there are concerns around reading and writing, I guess, of the brain, right?
Yeah, that's one way of putting it. Yeah, you know.
And so where do you see the biggest challenges from policy perspective here in neuroethics? What would you suggest, policymakers should be really thinking about here?
Um, well, I actually think that maybe the biggest challenge is to broaden neuroethics, to extend to a greater slice of neuroscience. I mean, there's quite a bit of neuroscience that goes on that has a lot of ethical implications, uh, and from all kinds of human neuroscience, but even neuroscience on animals, for instance. And um, I think that neuroethics and bioethics are sort of relegated for the most part. They're done by people who tend to not be the same people who do the neuroscientific work. And I think that there's been a push recently to integrate more neuroethical thought into everyday bread and butter neuroscience, which has been really, I think, valuable for policymakers and for the scientists involved and for the neuroethicists involved. And I'd like to see more of that. I think that there are lots of neuroethical issues in science all over the place, and only a small fraction of them are really being explored in conjunction with the people doing the science.
Hmm. Yeah, I don't know a lot about this, but do you see this sort of a continuous function? In other words, if it is continuous, you can say, this is the limit beyond which you cannot go. But if it is a discontinuous sort of a step function change, then it has different implications for policy, right? You have to say you have to stay at level zero. You can never think about level one. Where do you think this ethical issues will ultimately end up in? We see the technology developing quite fast in many areas. It doesn't, at least from on the surface, doesn't look like the brain is so special that we will never be able to figure that out. Granted, it's a very complex organ, but presumably in 20, 30, 40, 50 years, our understanding of that will be a lot higher. And if we understand it properly, then all the privacy goes out of the window. You have to think about the individual's freedom, all of that stuff. It all gets interconnected, right? So do you see this as gradually increasing, or do you see that we will go from sort of level zero to level one and all hell breaks loose?
Um, well, I think as we learn more, different ethical questions arise, and sometimes you can foresee what they are before we get there, and it's nice to think about them before we're faced with them in real life. But I actually never. I think that it's unlikely that we will really ever understand everything about the brain. But we will definitely understand far more than we do now, and I think it's important to keep the neuroethical questions in our sights, and not just get so taken up by enthusiasm about the next exciting thing we're learning that we forget to think about how what we're learning has implications for people and for future people and for the ways in which we structure our society, and I think we need to think about those things.
So in conclusion, Adina, if you look forward 5-10 years, fairly tactically, 5-10 years, where do you see the biggest risk is? We talked about neurotechnologies, we talked about neuroethics, we talked about deep brain stimulation. Many of these technologies coming to the fore. Where do you think, are the biggest risks for humanity are in this area?
The biggest risks for humanity are I don't think, at the moment in neuroscience. I think they're in climate science. And I guess, the biggest risk, I think, is in public misunderstanding of science generally, but in neuroscience as well. And I think that this last year has really shown how deeply mistrustful people are of science and how deeply they fail to understand what science is really about, and how important it is to sort of keep us from self-destructing. And so I think there's not an area in neuroscience that I think is going to put us all at risk, but I think that maybe like blowback from science deniers and people who are anti-scientific, because understanding the brain might make you, for instance, question teachings of the religious leaders or something. I think that that's a much bigger risk, in my view, that people will reject brain science because they don't like what it might say to them. And that I am not saying that you cannot have religious views and be scientific, but I think that people tend to think that it's an either or choice, and I think that might be the most dangerous thing.
Just one more quick thing. I just want to get your perspective on this. Is there anything from a neuroscience perspective, anything structural about that? In other words, your thought processes, at the very highest level, let's say you categorize people into more prone to using scientific process, data analysis, and those who are less willing to do so. Is there anything structural about the brain, or it's all software?
I don't know that I understand the question. I mean, there's obviously a ton of stuff that's structural about the brain. I don't think there's structure at many levels. I'm not sure there's a clear distinction between hardware and software in the brain. Okay. But we don't understand what distinguishes people who are pro-science and anti-science at a brain level. I guess my point was that I think the biggest threats aren't coming from the science, they're coming from science denial. I think we have in science both ways to foresee bad things that might occur and try to counteract them. And we also have ways of making people's lives better that, unless those things are pursued, we won't be doing that. And I think that that's a much bigger threat than the kinds of threats that, or the kinds of problems that might arise from our continued attempts to try to make people's lives better.
Excellent. Yeah, this has been great, Adina. Thanks so much for spending time.
Sure, my pleasure.
Thank you.
Great to talk to you. Thanks.
Bye. This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com.